Joining our conversation, Congresswoman Elaine Luria of Virginia. She's, of course, a member of the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection. Congresswoman, I don't know if you heard all of Dan Goldman's point, but we've been talking about how much evidence the committee has gathered to its great credit and how aggressive it has been in pursuing the innermost members of Trump's inner circle, including his family members. Could you talk to us about the committee's strategic decision to include some of the family members in the testimony, perhaps even as early as tonight?
Well, I think it is impressive the number of people who have spoken to the committee. As was mentioned, we've interviewed over 1,000 people. We have over 140,000 documents. And, although there's some people who have defied subpoenas from the committee, continue to, say that they won't testify or appear before the committee, the fact that those closest to the president, his direct family members, have spoken to the committee and spoken frankly to the committee about the events of that day and other things surrounding January 6th, I think is a huge testament to the work of the committee and will be very valuable in presenting the information. I know that we seek to paint a full picture of the events that led up to that day, the things that happened on January 6th, and that's a key part of it, hearing from those people who have the most direct evidence and probably some of the people who have the most direct knowledge of what his thought process could have been throughout these events.
How much is the committee informed in this public phase by the failures of past attempts to hold Donald Trump accountable for his conduct in office?
I think that the committee set out with this to get to the bottom of the truth about the events of January 6th. I would say personally, as a member of the committee, that hasn't informed my work directly. I have really been looking for the facts and just to understand how broad and how deep this conspiracy was, the attempt to pull all the different levers of government within different agencies, the pressure that was applied on the vice president, all of those elements. It's a full picture that we need to paint for the American people. So that hasn't factored into my personal view of the work that we're doing.
What will the barometer for success be, in your view, in terms of what people are talking about, say, 24 hours from right now?
Well, I hear a lot about the committee from people in my district. As I go around, the thing that people say to me the most as they're a member of Congress, is they come up to me and they say, thank you for the work you're doing on this committee. I think it's really important that we understand everything that happened. And so, my barometer will be when I'm back in the district over this weekend, what I hear from people across the district and essentially what impression it's made. And, I think that they'll be enlightened by the information that we're going to share this evening.
Is there a surreal dynamic? I mean, we watched Kevin McCarthy banter with reporters today and say things that are diametrically opposed to things that Kevin McCarthy said in the days after the insurrection. I mean, can you just take us inside what it feels like up there when the work of the committee has been bipartisan, has sought to be apolitical, but an aggressive pursuit of the facts? And you've got, this sort of, I don't know if peanut gallery is an insult to peanuts, but you've got this other side that is up until hours before this hearing revising facts that they once stipulated as facts.
It is a drastic difference between the words that we heard from Minority Leader McCarthy right after January 6th. At that point, he was saying the right things. He said, we need to get to the bottom of this. We need to understand the facts. We need to hold people accountable. Today, he's out there essentially just, I think, embarrassing himself with his remarks, because how could anyone, look over my shoulder and see the Capitol being overrun by thousands of people who were violent, that led to deaths, that attempted to obstruct the work of the Congress, in which he's supposed to be a leader within this Congress? How can he not have more concern to get to the facts and get to the truth? I truly think it's embarrassing. And when history looks back at this, it'll be clear that he was on the wrong side of history.
What do you make of the fact that even in Trump's family and closest inner circle, you have people that cooperated with the committee, like his daughter and his son-in-law, who are doing quite a bit of asserting the version of their events and participation in the final days and weeks of the Trump presidency. And you've got dead enders like Steve Bannon and the trade guy willing to go to jail not to tell you what happened in the White House.
Well, I think clearly they're avoiding talking to the committee because there's something they don't want us to know. I feel like if they defy the subpoenas of the committee, that they fail to appear, that they're trying to hide something. But I'll tell you, we've talked to enough people that I think we've gotten to the bottom of the facts. And again, these are two more people you've mentioned who I think will stand on the wrong side of history.
Congresswoman, I know you have a busy night ahead, but I wonder if you could sort of give us a viewer's guide. I mean, the expectations have been set sky high by the committee members themselves. Congressman Raskin talked about blowing the roof off the House. Adam Kinzinger said it would change history. What is your expectation-setting viewer's guide for watching tonight?
I think that this will really open people's eyes. Over the course of the last year and a half since the attack on the Capitol, people have had an opportunity to hear little bits and pieces, and people's lives are busy. They really haven't had time perhaps to sit down and dig into this in a way that they understand the chronology, the depth and breadth of all of it. But the work of the committee, I think, will put that all together and paint a full picture so that people can understand. And I'll tell you that from what I've learned over the work of this committee in the last year and a half, all of this makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I think when Americans watch this and they understand the gravity of it, not that it's an event that happened in the past, it's something that remains a real threat today. I think that there are threats to our democracy moving forward. And as a legislative committee, our important role is to provide oversight, to provide recommendations, legislative recommendations to prevent something like this from happening. So it's still very relevant and pertinent today. And I think once people understand and hear the full story over the course of our hearings, that will be clear why the work of this committee is so important.
One of your witnesses, Cassidy Hutchinson, who was a special assistant to the president, which when I worked there was sort of the second or third most senior official in any West Wing. There's reporting in Politico today that she's changed counsel so that she could cooperate more fulsomely with the committee. When the committee talks about administration officials testifying, is she one of them? And can you speak to her interest in participating more fulsomely?
I'm not going to talk about specific witnesses other than those who are going to be speaking tonight. Tonight we're going to hear from the first Capitol Police officer, a woman, Caroline Edwards, who was overrun by the rioters, and she's going to tell her firsthand account of what that meant to her, the traumatic brain injury that she suffered. We're also going to hear from a documentarian, Nick Quested, who was on the ground embedded with the Proud Boys and has some unique insights that he's going to share with the public about the events of that day. So other witnesses will be announcing those as we get closer to the hearings.
What is your reaction to Fox News, a purveyor of a lot of the disinformation that excited and animated the insurrectionists themselves, purveyors of conspiracy theories about the election result itself, not carrying the bipartisan select committee hearings? What's your reaction to that decision?
I'm disappointed. I want this to reach the widest number of people across the country. I'm happy that there's a wide range of networks, both broadcast and cable, that are going to carry it, and people will be able to find it online. I'll tell you that after we wrap up here, I'm going to be talking on Fox News, so I hope I'll reach some of those viewers and encourage them to watch it on the stations where it is available.
Yeah, it's going to be over on Fox Business. It would be wild if they had some sort of surge in ratings. I guess it would say something good. I guess my last question for you is: there's been some reporting this week about the political risks you face in a pretty divided part of the country, a divided district. Do you have any personal nervousness or anxiety or misgivings about your role on the Select Committee?
I don't at all. When I went into this, as a Democrat who represents a Republican-leaning district, I understood, perhaps this might not be popular with people at home. And if that presents some political risk to me, I'll still be able to sleep at night because I know that I did the right thing.